The Tuesday my mother told me I was no longer welcome at Sunday dinner. I was sitting in the back of an Uber on Storrow Drive watching the Charles River for the second time that winter. I remember the exact mile marker because I'd just hung up with a lawyer in Chicago about a patent filing, and my phone buzzed against my thigh almost the second I ended the call. A text from my mother. 5 words. Don't come this weekend, please. The please killed me. My mother never said please. Not to me. Not to anyone. Margaret Holloway Asher used please the way other people used profanity, only when she truly meant to wound. I should probably back up. My name is Wren. I'm 31 years old, and until about 8 months ago, I was the kind of daughter my family liked to forget existed at parties. I have 2 older brothers, both of them golden, both of them loud, both of them exactly the kind of men my father bragged about at his country club in Wellesley. Carter is a cardiothoracic surgeon at Mass General. Brennan runs my father's real estate development firm out of an office on Newbury Street that costs more per square foot than most people's mortgages. And then there was me, the one who studied biochemistry at MIT and then disappeared into a basement lab in Cambridge for 6 years and came out the other side with what my mother referred to at every available opportunity as Wren's Little Science Project. The Little Science Project was a company, a biotech startup developing target enzyme therapies for kids with rare metabolic disorders. The kind of work that doesn't make you rich and doesn't make you famous and doesn't, as my mother once said over Christmas brunch in front of my Aunt Vivian, do anything a normal woman of your age should be doing. I'd stopped correcting her by then. There was no point. My mother had decided, somewhere around my 23rd birthday, that I was a disappointment, and she was a woman who committed to her decisions the way other women committed to their gardens, tenderly, daily, with a kind of obsessive maintenance that nobody asked her to perform. So when the text came on Storrow Drive, I knew what it meant. Sunday dinner at the house in Wellesley was the only thread I still had to my family, and someone had finally cut it. I called Brennan, he didn't pick up. I called my father, he didn't pick up either. I sat in the back of that Uber with my phone in my lap and watched the river go past, and I thought, all right, okay. So this is how it ends. What I didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I'd been ready for this conversation for almost 3 years. Let me tell you about my grandfather. Theodore Asher was the kind of man people wrote profiles about in the Globe. He started with a single pharmacy in Brookline in 1962 and built it into a regional health services company that, by the time he sold it to a private equity group in 2009, employed almost 2,000 people across New England. He was kind. He was stubborn. He had the bluest eyes I've ever seen on a human being, and he used to make me tomato sandwiches on Wonder Bread with too much mayonnaise every Saturday afternoon from the time I was 6 until the summer I left for college. My grandfather understood me in a way my parents never bothered to. He understood that I was quiet because I was paying attention, not because I had nothing to say. He understood that when I wanted to spend my 14th birthday at the Museum of Science instead of at the mall, that wasn't a phase, that was a person. He understood, before I did, that my brothers were going to be fine in this world, because the world was built for them, and that I was going to need something else. Some other kind of foundation. He died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. I was the only one with him. My mother was at a charity luncheon in Newport. My father was in Aspen. Carter was in surgery. Brennan didn't pick up. I held my grandfather's hand for 40 minutes after he stopped breathing because I couldn't think of anything else to do. 2 weeks later, in the lawyer's office on State Street, I found out what he'd done. My grandfather owned 41% of a holding company. That holding company owned, among other things, the building my father's real estate firm operated out of, 3 commercial properties in the seaport, a quiet little chunk of a regional bank, and most importantly, the original family trust that paid out quarterly distributions to my father, my mother, my brothers, and a handful of cousins. The whole structure had been my grandfather's design. He'd set it up in the 80s to take care of his only son, my father, who had, by my grandfather's own private admission, never actually built anything himself. My father's real estate firm was funded by the trust. The Wellesley house was carried by the trust. My parents' lifestyle, the country club and the second home in Marblehead, and the cars and the trips and the endless lunches my mother organized for her friends, all of it ran through that trust like water through a riverbed. And 3 years before he died, my grandfather had quietly transferred his 41% stake to me alone. Not my brothers, not my father, to me. He'd done it the right way, with lawyers and signed documents and a notarized letter explaining his reasoning. I read that letter twice in the office on State Street. The lawyer, a soft spoken man named Mr. Kavanaugh, who had handled my grandfather's affairs for 30 years, watched me read it without saying a word. When I was done, he asked if I had any questions. I had one. Do they know? He shook his head. Your grandfather's instructions were specific. The transfer was completed 3 years ago, but he didn't want it disclosed to the rest of the family until you decided otherwise. As of this moment, your father believes the trust is being administered by an independent trustee. He doesn't know that the independent trustee answers to you. I sat in that office for a long time. I asked Mr. Kavanaugh what would happen if I never told them. He said the structure would continue as it was. Quarterly distributions to my parents and brothers, exactly as my grandfather had set up. Nothing would change. I would be, in his exact words, a silent presence with absolute authority. I asked what would happen if I changed something. He looked at me for a long moment and said, then everything would change. I went home to my apartment in Cambridge that night and sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator and cried until I couldn't see. Not because I was angry, not even because I was grieving, though I was. I cried because for the first time in my entire adult life, somebody had seen me. My grandfather had seen me all the way through, and he'd left me a country to rule that nobody else even knew existed. I didn't tell anyone, not my brothers, not my father, not my mother. I kept going to Sunday dinner. I kept letting my mother make her little comments about my science project and my unmarried status and my hair, which she always thought I should grow out, and my clothes, which she always thought were too plain. I kept watching my father pour his good wine and lecture my brothers about market cycles. I kept doing the dishes afterward because my mother thought it was good for me to stay useful. For 3 years, I sat at that table and I knew that the wine in his glass and the food on her plate and the very chair I was sitting in flowed back through a chain of holdings and trusts and quarterly disbursements to a decision my grandfather had made in a lawyer's office because he loved me and they didn't. And I didn't say anything. I'll tell you why. Because my grandfather had also said something to me the last lucid afternoon we had together that I've never been able to shake. He said, Ren, people show you who they are. The kindest thing you can do is believe them the first time. I wanted to believe my family was better than they were. I really did. So when my mother's text came on Storrow Drive that Tuesday, I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I didn't call my therapist. I went home to my apartment, made myself a grilled cheese sandwich, sat down at my kitchen table, and stared at the wall for about an hour. Then I called Mr. Kavanaugh. I told him I wanted to come in on Thursday. I told him I wanted to review the full structure. He didn't ask why. He just said he'd have coffee ready. What had happened, I learned over the following days, was this. My company had reached a milestone in our lead clinical trial, a small one in pediatric metabolic terms. 6 children with a disease that usually kills them before they turn 10 had, after 18 months on our therapy, started producing the enzyme their bodies couldn't make on their own. The Globe ran a piece about it. A short piece buried on page 4 of the business section, mostly because the reporter happened to know one of my board members from Harvard. My mother read that piece. I know because she sent it to my Aunt Vivian with a single line beneath it. Aunt Vivian, God bless her, forwarded the whole exchange to me 3 days later because she thought I deserved to see it. My mother had written, apparently Ren's hobby has reached the newspaper. I suppose we should be polite about it. The whole thing is funded by her grandfather's leftovers, of course, but she does seem to enjoy the attention. Her grandfather's leftovers. I read that line 3 times. Then I read it again. And I understood finally that my mother had spent 3 years cashing checks from a man she didn't even respect, raising children she didn't even like, and telling herself a story about being the matriarch of something important. And the story only worked if I stayed beneath her. The globe piece had moved me an inch out of the basement she'd put me in, and her response had been to pull the only lever she still thought she had: Sunday dinner. Banishment. The please. That was Tuesday. Thursday, I sat in Mr. Kavanaugh's office and reviewed every page of the holding structure. Friday, I called my brother Carter because of all of them. He was the one I still half loved. He didn't pick up either. He sent a text that said, "Mom asked me not to engage. Sorry, kid. Maybe give it some space." I gave it some space. I gave it exactly 5 days. The following Wednesday, my mother hosted what she called a spring announcement dinner. It was an annual thing started by my grandmother decades ago, where the family gathered to talk about plans for the year, investments, trips, my father's company performance, my brother's careers. It was always held at the Wellesley house. It always involved at least 12 people: aunts, uncles, cousins, and the inner circle of family friends. I had not been invited. I went anyway. I want to be careful here because I've replayed this moment 1,000 times in my head, and I want to tell it honestly. I did not show up to make a scene. I showed up because for the first time in my adult life, I felt the full weight of what my grandfather had handed me. And I knew that if I didn't use it, I was going to spend the rest of my life letting my mother shrink me down to fit her shelf. And I wasn't going to do that anymore. I drove out to Wellesley in my old Subaru. I parked on the street, not in the driveway. I walked up to the front door in jeans and a wool sweater, and I rang the doorbell of the house I'd grown up in. My brother Brennan opened it. He looked at me. He looked over his shoulder. He looked back at me, and he said very quietly, "Wren, now is not a good time." I said, "I know." I walked past him. The dining room was at the back of the house through the long hallway with the family photographs, all of which featured my brothers prominently and me when I appeared at all in the corner of a school picture or at the edge of a holiday card. The hallway smelled like the lilies my mother always ordered for events. I remember thinking as I walked down it that I had walked down that exact hallway maybe 2,000 times in my life and never once felt like a guest. I felt like a guest now. I pushed open the dining room door. My mother was at the head of the table. My father was to her right. Around them, 11 other people in their good clothes, holding their good wine mid-laugh over something I hadn't heard. The laughter stopped. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went, for one fraction of a second, completely empty, and then it filled back in with the expression I knew best from her: cold, controlled, faintly amused. "Wren," she said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't," I said. My father set down his glass. My Aunt Vivian, sitting halfway down the table, met my eyes and held them. She nodded, just once, almost invisibly. I think about that nod a lot. I think about how it might have been the first piece of solidarity I'd received from my family in a decade, and how she knew somehow, just from looking at me, that I'd come to do something hard. My mother stood up. "Wren, this is not the moment. We're in the middle of dinner. If you'd like to talk later, I'm sure we can find a time." "I don't want to talk later," I said. "I want to talk now, in front of everyone." The silence in that room had a shape. I could feel it pressing against my collarbone. My father, who had not looked at me directly in maybe 6 months, finally raised his eyes. He said, "Wren, you weren't invited. I think you should leave." I looked at him. I looked at my mother. And then I said very carefully the words I'd been holding in my chest for 3 years. "I own 41% of the holding company. I have since Grandpa died. I am the trust's beneficial controller. Every distribution any of you have received in the last 3 years has been approved quietly by me. The roof over this house, the wine in your glass, the car in the driveway, all of it has for 3 years run through me. And until tonight, I never said a word. Nobody spoke." My mother's hand was at her throat. Not the theatrical gesture I'd seen her perform 100 times at parties. A real one. Her fingers were trembling. My father's mouth had opened slightly. He looked like a man who had just walked into a glass door. Brennan, behind me in the doorway, said, "What?" I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on my mother. "I know about the email to Aunt Vivian. I know what you wrote about me. I know what you wrote about me. I know what you've been telling people for years. I know that you told my brother not to engage. I know that you sent me a text on Tuesday telling me not to come on Sunday. I have spent 3 years trying to believe that you might still be capable of loving me. I am done." My mother opened her mouth. I held up a hand. "I am not finished. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Kavanagh's office will be sending the four of you new disbursement schedules. The quarterly amounts you've been receiving will be reduced, effective immediately to the minimum required by the original trust language Grandpa wrote in 1987. That number, in case you're curious, is significantly less than what you've been getting. I've also instructed Mr. Kavanagh to begin the process of terminating the corporate lease on the Newbury Street office. Brennan, I'd recommend you find a new location for the firm within 90 days, because the holding company is no longer interested in carrying that lease. The Wellesley house is held in a separate vehicle, and you'll keep it, but the property tax and maintenance contributions from the trust are ending on June 1st. My father said, "You can't." "I can," I said. "I have, it's done." My mother finally found her voice. It came out lower than I'd ever heard it. "Ren, you don't understand what you're doing. You're not thinking clearly. We are your family." I looked at her. I looked at her for a long, long time. "No," I said. "You're not. You haven't been for years. I just kept hoping you'd come back." I turned around. I walked past Brennan, who hadn't moved. I walked down the lily-scented hallway. I let myself out the front door. I got in my old Subaru and I drove all the way back to Cambridge with the windows down, even though it was 38 degrees, because I needed to feel the cold on my face. I didn't cry. Not then. I cried later, in my kitchen, around 2 in the morning, into a dish towel for about an hour. I cried for the version of my mother I'd wanted my whole life. I cried for my grandfather. I cried for the little girl I'd been at that dining room table for 31 years, eating dessert with her head down. Then I went to bed. The fallout took longer than I expected. My father called the next morning, then the day after, then for 2 weeks straight. The first calls were furious. The middle ones were strategic. He tried to explain to me, in a tone I recognized from his negotiations with city councils, that I was creating a problem we don't need to have. The last ones, the ones in the third week, were softer. He asked if we could have lunch. I said no. He asked if I'd reconsider the Newbury Street lease. I said no. He asked if I understood what I was doing to my mother. I said with as much kindness as I could find that I had spent 31 years understanding what she was doing to me, and that the mat at long last had stopped working in her favor. Brennan moved his firm to a smaller office in Back Bay. He took my call exactly once in May to tell me he understood. He said it briefly and he didn't elaborate, but I could hear in his voice that something in him had shifted. He told me my mother had not been speaking to him because he'd refused to take her side. He told me he thought, looking back, that maybe she had never really loved any of us in the way we were supposed to be loved. He said he was sorry. I told him I was sorry too. Carter sent a long email. I read it once. I didn't respond. Maybe one day. My mother didn't call. Not once. She wrote me a letter in June on her good stationery, 300 pages. It was the longest piece of writing she'd ever directed at me. She used the word betrayal 11 times. I counted the second time I read it because I was curious about her vocabulary under stress. She never apologized. She never asked how I was. She told me my grandfather would have been ashamed. I put the letter in a drawer. The Wellesley house was sold in October. My parents moved to a condo in Back Bay. From what Aunt Vivian tells me, my mother has started telling people that the holding company experienced restructuring issues and that they decided to downsize. I don't correct the story. It doesn't matter. My company closed our Series C in November. The therapy that helped those 6 children is now in expanded trials with 42 more. We've added a second program for a different metabolic disorder. I hired a chief scientific officer from Stanford. I bought a small house in Belmont with a yard for a dog I haven't gotten yet, but plan to. I'm thinking a rescue. Something quiet. Something that didn't have an easy life and has learned, the way I have, that the love you build yourself is more durable than the love you inherit. Aunt Vivian and I have dinner once a month. She tells me about her garden. I tell her about the kids in the trial. She tells me my grandfather would be proud, and I let myself believe her. I want to say one thing before I stop, because I know there are people listening to this who have been where I was, who have spent years sitting at a table that didn't actually want them, who have done the dishes after dinners where they were never the guest of honor, who have been told in 1,000 ways, big and small, that they were the wrong kind of daughter or son or sister or brother, who have been called the disappointment, the difficult one, the one who never quite fit. I want you to know something. The power you think you don't have is almost always more than you've been told. The people in your life who shrink you do it because they need you small. You are not obligated to stay small for them. You are not obligated to keep eating their dessert with your head down. You are not obligated to wait for an apology that they are constitutionally incapable of giving. My grandfather left me 41% of a holding company, but that wasn't really what he left me. What he left me was permission. Permission to stop hoping, permission to stop performing, permission to walk into a dining room I'd been pushed out of and tell the truth, all of it, in front of everyone, and walk back out without apologizing. You don't need a grandfather to give you that permission. You can give it to yourself. I'm Ren. Thank you for listening. If the story meant something to you, I hope you'll stay, because I have more of them, and every one of them is for the daughter who finally stopped waiting. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next week. I've thought a lot, in the months since that dinner in Wellesley, about what actually happened in that room. Not the dramatic part. Not the part where I said the words I've been holding in my chest for 3 years. The other part. The part where my mother's hand went to her throat and I watched her face go empty for one fraction of a second, and I realized I was watching the exact moment a person ran out of ways to be cruel to me. What I keep coming back to is this. My mother didn't shrink me because she was a powerful person. She shrank me because she was a frightened one. Frightened people make smaller cages for the people around them because they're already living in their own. My father did the same thing in a different key. Carter did it by silence. Brennan did it by going along. None of them set out to harm me. They were all just protecting a story about themselves that I happened to threaten by existing the way I did. And I think the hardest, most honest thing I learned through all of this is that staying at a table where you are not wanted is not love. It's a kind of self-betrayal that people call loyalty because the real word is too painful to say out loud. I called it loyalty for 31 years. My grandfather called it something else. He called it waiting. He told me once, near the end, that the saddest people he'd ever met were the ones who spent their whole lives waiting for someone who had already decided not to come. I don't want to be that person anymore. I think there's a kind of strength people don't talk about much, which is the strength of being patient with yourself while you figure out what's actually true. I didn't walk into that dining room overnight. I sat with what I knew for 3 full years before I used any of it. I let myself grieve the family I wanted before I dismantled the one I had. That was not weakness, and it was not indecision. That was me trying to be a person of conscience instead of a person of revenge. There's a difference, and I think it matters. If I could tell you one thing, it would be this. The people who love you do not need you to be smaller in order to feel safe. The ones who do are not loving you. They're using you, sometimes gently, sometimes for decades, and the kindest thing you can eventually do for both of you is to stop letting them, not with cruelty, with clarity, with the quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud because it has finally stopped asking permission. My grandfather gave me 41% of a holding company, but what he really gave me was the chance to choose myself in front of everyone, without apologizing. I think that's available to most of us, if we're willing to be patient enough and honest enough and brave enough to use it.